Good afternoon, I'm Jayson Ellis from the Timaru District Council. My role here is the Building Control Manager, part of which is to manage the earthquake prone building legislation. So I've been asked to provide an update of where we're currently at within the project, moving forward, what we've done so far, and provide some context around those sorts of things. So I'm just going to refer to some notes as we go through this presentation. And so what I will cover is an update on where we're at with the policy, what it means to the public so far, how many buildings have been identified to date, where the current issues have been, or rather any issues that have been identified throughout the process that we've carried out so far, the who, what and when of what the building owner's responsibilities are and where they lie, and a little bit on the EPB methodology and how the engineers and their part to play in the process, how that fits into the system. So what this means for the overall project. So this is probably something that many of you already know, but just for the benefit of those who don't, the legislation basically revolves around identifying unreinforced masonry buildings that are older than 1976. So that's where the legislation lies, and that's the buildings that we're focusing on. So it's from 76 and older. The methodology that the engineers will use in identifying and assessing these buildings has been formulated by the Ministry of Innovation and Employment, MB for short, in Wellington, and so they've provided quite a lot of guidance around how this process works and then how to identify those buildings and the engineers involved in that process, how they get to use that methodology as well. An EPB or a building that has been identified as an earthquake prone building is at potentially a greater risk to any other building of failure in the event of a moderate earthquake. So that isn't to mean that the whole building is at risk. There could be just certain parts. So it's important to understand that even if there is a small part of the building that doesn't meet the MBS percentage level, that doesn't mean that the whole building, rather it does mean that the whole building is actually deemed to be earthquake prone, but there is only a small element, or could be a small element of that building that needs the repair and not necessarily the whole building. It's also important for the building owners to understand the importance of, if your building has been identified as earthquake prone and you have received official notification, that notification will come via a letter and a notice, and that notice must be either displayed on the main entrance or prominent places, the terminology that's used, on the building, and it could be either on the building or immediately adjacent to it, but it must be displayed. So the process of identifying, or rather the council's process and part that we play in identifying earthquake prone buildings, is to go back and look at the records that we have on file of a particular building. So we've gone through the special consultative process to identify our priority routes and thoroughfares. So that was done back in 2018, that was confirmed. And so from that we created some maps of where these thoroughfares exist, and any building within those thoroughfares are deemed to be those potential priority buildings. And so part of that process is for us to go through, look at the records that we have on file and try and determine whether the building fits the criteria of being potentially earthquake prone, and then if that is the case, we contact the building owner, and from that point the building owner has 12 months to provide that initial assessment, and then from that assessment we make a determination whether it is or whether it is not earthquake prone. Again, part of that process we use the information that has been previously done, so assessments rather, that have been previously done on that particular building. And so some building owners have had engineers in, they've done a report, and it might be, say, 5 to 10 years old, this report. So there is certain criteria that needs to be met if we're to use that or those reports and be able to use them for a determination of whether the building is earthquake prone or not. Some of those reports don't meet that criteria, and therefore that doesn't mean that they can't be used, but will mean that they'll be used in conjunction with an assessment done via the methodology, and then the engineer will then provide that assessment to us, having considered the other reports that have been done previously. So they're not, I guess really what I'm saying is they're not a complete waste of time or not completely unusable. They can certainly be used to a certain extent. And they may or may not actually meet that criteria. So they are still very important and part of what we've used. And my colleague Jonathan, who is working through this process, he's made some notes which I'll just refer to. And which is really just reiterating, I guess, what I've said, but he's got here, some owners may have some assessments completed prior to being requested. These can be considered by us, but still need to meet the requirements of the specific sections within the methodology. And that is somewhat different potentially to what the information that we've had received. So it's trying to join the dots, so to speak, in terms of the information that we've historically received and the new information that needs to be provided. So hopefully that sort of identifies or explains our internal process to at least identify the buildings and then get that initial notification out to the building owners. So a bit of a progress to date is in very general terms, the identification process and therefore contacting the building owners and letting them know that their building is potentially earthquake prone. We have done the Timaru, Geraldine and Pleasant Point townships, and we have done around about 2/3 of the Timaru CBD area, bearing in mind that the time frame we have to work to for our potential priority buildings is to have that identification process completed by July 2022. So we're well on track in meeting that logistical time frame, but hopefully we'll get that done within plenty of time. So we've got a little bit of time up our sleeve for any other curly sort of questions that might come from that process. So in terms of the Timaru CBD area, just for context, we've started at the south end of Stafford Street, working on our priority routes and thoroughfares, and moving our way north, if you like. So we're up around about the Beswick Street, Church Street sort of location on Stafford Street. We have seen and received some ISA reports come in already, and so we expect those to start to filter through as the year progresses, and potentially that will increase once those time frames start to come to a point where that 12-month period is about to expire. So just about the 12-month time frame, once you've received a notification from council to provide an initial seismic assessment, you've got 12 months to provide that assessment, and that means engaging an engineer and getting them to do their assessment of your building. You can, however, if that 12-month period is going to be a little bit tight, you can apply to council for an extension, and that can be extended for up to another 12 months. But that only is for certain sort of circumstances that need to be met. So another part of the update, the buildings that have been officially identified within our district as earthquake prone, we've currently got 11 on the register, and they have been lodged with on the national register, which the public can access. And so those buildings, some of them are owned by the Timaru District Council, and some are privately owned as well. So as I say, those assessments are coming through, and we're starting to work through that process. Just flicking through some more notes. They're just maps of the areas. So in terms of what this sort of means for a building owner, for a building tenant, and for the public in general, there's obligations, I guess, from all of everyone that's involved. So you've got the building owner that's essentially ultimately responsible for their building and for the tenants that reside in it. So therefore, the building owner themselves do need to understand and know as much as they possibly can about what their obligations are in this process. To do so, there's lots of information that's on the Ministry's website, but what's probably more beneficial and more helpful to local building owners is to come in and see the staff here at the Timaru District Council. So myself or Jonathan, who are working on this project, we can provide you with answers to pretty much any question that you have, just so that you've got a really good understanding of what it means for you and what part you play in this process. So previously I've talked about the time frame for providing the reports, so that's that 12-month time frame for providing the ISA. One thing that's worth working through is essentially, in one of the previous workshops we've had, we mentioned that, and especially up the likes of Stafford Street and Main Streets, where there are buildings that are, there's tenancies within a larger building, and all those individual tenancies may be owned by separate people. But ultimately, it's still one building. So to have that assessment done will affect all of those multiple tenancies. So what we're suggesting and really urging you to do is those building owners that are affected in those situations really need to get together and have good discussions about how that's going to affect them moving forward, because doing it or working it in isolation isn't possibly going to be the best way to do that. It's certainly going to be more costly in terms of doing things individually. The amount of seismic work that might be required, if done individually, could be more expensive than doing it and looking at it as a whole building. The engineers will, and the engineer that you engage to do your assessment will hopefully give you some guidance around that as well. And if not, certainly ask for that, because they'll be looking at what the building and how the building will perform, and what those characteristics are. So they'll need to consider that anyway. So it's really important, if that is a situation that you're in, then I suggest that it would be a very good idea, if you haven't already done so, to get those conversations up and running with the other adjacent building owners, because it'll be hugely beneficial in the long run for yourself, for them, and of course for us trying to do those assessments as well, and of course with the consequent building consents that will come in following the assessment to do the seismic upgrade. If it can be done and looked at a whole building level, then that process will potentially be a bit more straightforward. So the lessons that we've learnt so far from the information that we've gathered from doing the desktop assessment of trying to determine whether the buildings are potentially earthquake prone and whether they meet the criteria. A lot of that, those learnings so far essentially has highlighted probably what we already know, and many of you will already know as well, is that the information we have on file relating to your building in the most part is very limited, shall we say. There are some buildings that have had recent building work which have had building consents, and that's been quite useful, but certainly there's a lot of buildings, and probably more so, that haven't had any sort of significant work done on them in recent time. So the information, the documentation that we have, plans and any kind of structural information is a bit limited. So that being the case, the amount of work that the engineer will need to do, certainly initially, and then afterwards, is going to be probably a little bit more involved because they don't have a lot of information they can work on. But that's unfortunately just really the way it works out. So that's really the biggest learning at this point is the lack of information that is available, historic information. The other learning essentially is, as I mentioned previously, about any previous assessments or building work that's been done previously, trying to determine what level of MBS that building has achieved after that work has been done, if there was a consent, has proven to be a little bit challenging as well, because a lot of the work wasn't really identified as earthquake strengthening. It was just some work that was being done, and so therefore there was not a great deal of consideration around what the MBS of that building was at that time. And we're probably talking about anywhere from 5 to 10 years and older. So work done within the last 5 years is probably a lot more information rich, if you like. But anything older than that, it's been a bit of a challenge to work through. So I'm not necessarily making any apologies for that, but that's just simply acknowledging what we've learnt so far, and has again highlighted the importance of having good quality information for varying reasons, and this is one of those. All right, so the methodology and the involvement from engineers. So the methodology, as I mentioned previously, is a document that the Ministry have created to provide some clarity and some consistency around the information that gets provided back to Council for them to make a decision. So it explains what the criteria for a building that a building needs to meet for it to be potentially earthquake prone. It works through the considerations that engineers will need to make when they are doing their initial assessments, and there's two different type of assessments that can be done. So the initial one is the initial seismic assessment, or ISA for short. So that's what's required to start with to try and determine whether the building is earthquake prone or not. Leading on from that is what's called a detailed seismic assessment, or a DSA. So that will be provided, and the engineer may do the ISA and the DSA all at the same time, and that's perfectly fine as well. But ultimately what the DSA highlights is the fact that we've identified that it is earthquake prone, and here is now the type of work that needs to be performed to achieve a certain MBS level. And as we know, that MBS level, or the minimum threshold that must be met, is 34% MBS or greater. Actually, on that, you as a building owner may be aware of some other influencing factors in terms of what MBS level needs to be achieved. Some other influencing factors could be banks, if money is being loaned, insurance companies, so they have their own views about what they are prepared to lend and or insure. So that's a discussion that you'll need to have with them. But in terms of meeting the minimum requirement of the legislation, it's 34%, and of course you can choose to do more than that. Engineers' reports, as I said, they'll provide an ISA to Council. They also refer to them as an IEP. So not to be confused, they're all talking about the same information, to be perfectly honest. And so you don't get confused about that. The terminology, there is lots of terminology sort of floating around, but in essence, it's all the same information. An IEP essentially comes from an engineer point of view rather than from the Ministry's legislation. So that's pretty much covering the methodology. In a previous workshop, we had a brief discussion around the change of use of a building. Now this can be somewhat confusing, And again, like everything is assessed on a case-by-case basis. Some of the work, the seismic work that you'll undertake, may not trigger a change of use at all. It may be that you want to change the use of the building. In any case, I strongly advise to come in and talk to us at council, and we can work through your individual case with you. And I would suggest that you bring your design professionals with you as well. That could include your engineer, and it could also include your designers as well, so that we can all have a discussion around what the minimum requirements need to be made, if any, over and above doing your seismic work. And I think that's important to stress that the main objective when if your building has been identified as earthquake prone and then you're going to carry out some seismic work, the main thing is to ensure that seismic work is actually carried out. The, I guess, lesser considerations, if I can use that term, is around what other necessary compliant factors need to be considered. And some of you will understand that accessible facilities is one of those considerations. Means of escape from fire is another consideration. But ultimately, every case is assessed on its own merit, and the best way to establish that is to come in and talk to us about it before you submit your consent, before you actually get your design confirmed in any way. Bring in your draft plans, ideas of how you're going to go about doing it, and then we can work through that process with you. Right, so that's pretty much what I have in terms of this session for today. Is there anything else, Wendy, you want to?
One question I'd like to ask is about time frames. So we've talked about the time frame for the ISA. What about getting the building work completed on those strategic priority routes?
Thank you, good question. So once the determination has been made that your building is earthquake prone, in the priority routes and thoroughfares, you've got 12.5 years as building owner to carry out that seismic work and have it completed. Now, having discussions actually just the other day with a local engineer, he has some clients working through this process, and they were wanting to know how can they go about doing it in different stages, and the answer to that question is they can. So any work can be done in stages, and there's two ways of doing that. So you can apply for a building consent to do all of the work, and then you just chip away at that over a period of time, ensuring that you've got it completed and signed off within that 12.5 year time frame. Or you can apply for separate building consents for certain elements of the building, and that might be easier to manage. You'll have individual CCCs for each consent, but it does allow you to do that work in stages, if you like, and get those stages signed off as you go, rather than doing it all in one process. So there are a couple of options there available. Again, come in and talk to us about that, and then we can have those discussions and work out obviously what's going to suit best for you in your case. All right.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And if anybody's got any queries, basically the message is give you a call.
Absolutely.
Come into the Timaru District Council.
So as mentioned before, I'm the building control manager, so you can call me anytime. Jonathan Craig is my colleague who is working on this particular project. And many of you have probably already spoken to him as well. So you're more than welcome to talk to him, send him an email, and arrange those meetings with either myself or Jonathan, and then if there are any other members of my team that need to be a part of that, those discussions, then we can bring them into the mix as well. All right, thank you very much.